welcome to the Talking Crop podcast. My name is Kathryn Seebruck, and I'm a commercial agriculture educator with University of Illinois Extension, serving Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. Talking Crop is a row crop production podcast with episodes occurring every other week during the growing season between May and September. In each episode, I bring on a guest speaker to discuss topics related to their areas of expertise. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Alison Robertson, professor of plant pathology and microbiology and extension field crops pathologist with Iowa State University. We discuss southern rust, tar spot, and the invaluable field crop disease resources from the Crop Protection Network. In the episode description, you'll find links to the Crop Protection Network resources that we discussed, along with a couple of Alison's articles, as well as a link to the 2025 University of Illinois Field Crop Disease and Insect Management Applied Research Report. For the next episode of Talking Crop, I'll be joined by Dr. Nathan Schroeder, Associate Professor of Nematode Anatomy and Biology in the Department of Crop Sciences at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We'll be discussing all things nematodes, including free soybean cyst nematode testing, nematodes in cover crops, and the research that Dr. Schroeder does on nematode biology. That episode will air on Wednesday, June 24th. And now, please enjoy this episode of Talking Crop, 2026 Field Crop Disease Outlook and Resources with Alison Robertson. Hello, Alison. Welcome to the Talking Crop podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today for today's episode.
Thanks very much for having me, Kathryn.
So I would like for you to start things off by just first introducing yourself, a little bit about yourself and your background and what your research focus is.
Sure. So I am a field crops extension pathologist at Iowa State University. I've been here since 2004, so this will be my 23rd season in the field.
Wow.
And I have a 70% extension appointment and 30% research. I do a lot of work on corn, but I also work on soybeans. But I generally think of myself more as a corn pathologist.
So, Alison, could you please actually start with a little bit of the basics before we get further into our conversation? I was hoping you could actually discuss for the listeners the disease triangle, what its components are, because I think that information is really important to help us understand some of the finer details of what we'll be talking about as our conversation progresses.
So this is a great start because my colleagues will tell you that I am obsessed with the disease triangle. So I love to talk about the disease triangle. But
Perfect.
Basically, this is like a really basic concept in plant pathology. It's the first thing that we learn about. And the disease triangle basically tells us that we need to have three things that are interacting to get disease. And those three things are a host. So that host has to be susceptible to the disease. So if we think about our corn hybrids and our soybean varieties, some of them are more susceptible than other varieties or hybrids to a disease, right? So the more susceptible our host is, the greater the risk of our disease. But I mean, we have the host, then we have to have the pathogen, right? So almost all of the pathogens that we deal with here in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt, survive in our residue, and some of them also survive in the soil. So if you think about the Midwest, the Corn Belt, right, we always have corn on the landscape. We always have soybean on the landscape. We always have pathogens, right? The only pathogen that doesn't survive up here would be the rusts. They have to blow up here from the south. But other than that, we have the pathogens. So if we have the pathogens and we have the host, why don't we get taken out by disease every year? And it's basically because the environment is so important. And that's one thing that's really been driven home to me since I've been at Iowa State, is how important that environment is. In my field trials, our plant susceptible hybrids, we'll go out there with literally buckets of inoculum of that pathogen, right? Buckets of millet seed that's colonized with that pathogen. We'll dump that pathogen on the corn. And if it's hot and dry, we're not going to get disease, right? We're not going to get northern corn leaf blight, for example, right? That environment is so important. And so I think that's a really good thing to think about when you're worried about disease, right? For example, if you're concerned about tar spot, right? Think about, know what kind of conditions tar spot likes to develop in, right? So cool, relatively moist, not too wet, but just cool conditions, moist conditions. You've had tar spot in that field before. You're planting a hybrid that, all of our hybrids are susceptible at some point, right, to tar spot. But so we have the corn. We know we've had tar spot in that field, so you probably got the inoculum in that field. And now, have we had cool, moist conditions? Okay, I could be at risk for tar spot, right? Because we have that whole triangle coming together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to understand all those things again, because we'll talk, of course, about very specific diseases here in a little bit. And when it comes to a producer maybe trying to predict whether a disease is going to be an issue this year, you have to take those three factors into account to really answer that question. Yes. So that's really great information. Thank you for that. And speaking of those diseases, are there any diseases of concern for you this year, or diseases that you're really kind of curious about how things will play out this year based on maybe what's happened last year or throughout the past couple of years?
Well, last year in Iowa, we had historic levels of southern rust, right? And so, of course, that's on everyone's mind this year, right? Is Are we going to see southern rust? Are we going to see southern rust? But then, so we've got southern rust. There's also tar spot, right? We've had tar spot for 10 years now. We're getting hybrids that are more resistant to that disease, but tar spot is still a concern to folks. So I would say tar spot and southern rust. And then I'm also hearing a lot of chatter out there about crown rot. So probably the last 5 or 6 years, crown rot seems to have been an issue. It is associated with certain hybrids, indicating, right, that we probably have susceptible hybrids out there on the landscape. And so, yeah, a lot of talk about crown rot and whether that could be a problem this year, especially here in Iowa for that corn that was planted I think it was April 21st to 23rd, 24th, before we had that cold, wet spell. There's a lot of concern about that crown rot could be a problem in that corn that was planted, around April the 20th to the 23rd. So I'm looking forward to seeing whether that really does pan out. But yeah, and then looking forward to seeing, are we going to get southern rust? Are we going to get tar spot? And yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
So with southern rust, if we want to focus on that for a little bit here, you mentioned how there's a lot of chatter about it now because of what happened last year. So can you go over a little bit of what happened last year in terms of, how big of an issue was it and what things led to that being such a prevalent issue throughout Iowa and, of course, other states throughout the Midwest last year?
So I think last year was basically just the perfect storm. If we think about the disease triangle, right, a lot of the hybrids that we grow here in the Midwest are susceptible to southern rust because southern rust is not a problem here, right? And so, breeders haven't had to breed resistance into our hybrids. So we have susceptible hybrids on the landscape. We actually also had some very resistant hybrids that just was serendipitous, right? But there were some hybrids that had good resistance. So that's our host side. If we think of the pathogen, so this is a pathogen that does not survive here in Iowa, and it has to be blown up to us from the south every year. So the spores, those orange spores that you see on the leaves of the plant, those get blown up to us from the south. So if we look at the south in 2005, my goodness, 2025. First of all, the corn acreage in the south increased dramatically in some states. Mississippi, Louisiana. I want to say that Louisiana planted 45% more corn acres in 2025 than they did in 2024. Mississippi, I can't remember the numbers, but Arkansas was maybe around about 15% more acres. So we had a lot more acres of corn planted in the south, in the south. And then in the south, because of the low corn prices, a lot of farmers there did not spray a fungicide. So they weren't managing the disease down there in the south that well to then prevent that inoculum coming up to us, right? And then the other thing was that inoculum has to get up to us on the winds. And so if you look at wind roses, if you compare wind roses from 2025 with 2024, 2021, I think, were some other years where we had pretty good southern rust. You'll see that we had a lot more wind directly from the south coming up to us in Iowa, Illinois. And also those winds were stronger than normal. So just bringing that inoculum here, right? So that's our pathogen. We had our pathogen got up here. Now we get to the environment. So if we think about June and July last year, first of all, we were warmer than usual. So southern rust really likes those warm conditions. 80 in the 80s is great for southern rust, really likes that. But I think more than temperature was rain. So we had a lot of precipitation. And across most of Iowa, we had 2 to 3 times as much more precipitation than normal, right? And so and the other thing about those precipitation is we had these precipitation events like every 4 or 5 days where we would get about over half an inch of rain, right? So kept the ground very, very, very wet, contributed to humidity in that lower canopy. So those leaves were staying wet. And the longer those leaves stay wet, the higher the southern rust severity is going to get. So there's been some really nice research done in like the 1980s in the greenhouse, but they were able to show that if you increase the time that leaves stayed wet from like 4 to 8 hours to 12 hours to 16 hours, the number of pustules on that leaf increased with the longer the leaf stayed wet, right? And so I really think that a warm summer and then the very, very wet conditions we had, that's what just drove that epidemic, really helped everything get established, and then it just starts churning out, right? And the other thing about southern rust is from infection to when it produces spores under optimum conditions is about 5 days. So every 5 days, we're getting these cycles of disease, right? Whereas if you look at something like tar spot, you're looking at about 2 to 3 weeks. Southern rust can just really build up very quickly and explode. So that's all the data that I've collected that kind of tells us why we had such severe southern rust last year.
Yeah, what you said earlier, the perfect storm, that's a perfect explanation of all those happenings for sure. And so you also mentioned how with southern rust, it blows in from the south. So It's not one of those situations where if you had a bad case of southern rust last year, it's not a guarantee that you're going to have it again this year because it doesn't overwinter up in the Midwest, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So like when we do research on some diseases, we're able to grow those pathogens in the lab, right?
Yeah.
And then inoculate. But with southern rust, we cannot grow it in the lab. We could, in theory, grow it in the greenhouse, right? What we would have to do is collect it from the plants and then inoculate plants in the greenhouse and then just keep it on those plants in the greenhouse. So southern rust is only going to live on corn leaves, right? Live corn leaves. Whereas other things we can grow on jello in the lab or, grow on millet seed or whatever the case may be. So, yes.
And so switching gears then to another disease that you mentioned being tar spot, can you kind of compare and contrast the two? I understand their conditions for disease development might be a little bit different. Of course, yes. Tar spot and southern rust are going to also be different in terms of whether that inoculum will stick around, yes. Through the winter. So can you talk a little bit about that and maybe compare and contrast the two?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the disease triangle, right? Because I'm obsessed with it. So, hosts like all of our hybrids are susceptible to some level. Some are more susceptible than others, right? But industry's done the breeders have done a really good job of bringing in more resistant hybrids. But everything's going to get tar spot. If we think about the pathogen, so tar spot is able to survive in the residue. And there's been a couple of studies done by people at Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, who have shown that fungus can survive over the winter. And then in spring produce spores that can then infect that corn and cause the disease again. So, and the other thing is, so if you're doing corn on corn, the residue's right there in the field, right? But if you're doing corn on soybean, that's still a concern because there's likely a cornfield neighboring the soybean field, right? Here in Illinois and Iowa. So when I think about crop rotation to manage diseases, we don't really rotate crops in our part of the world, right? Because so those spores, when they produce, they can also blow several hundred yards. And so they can infect a neighboring field, even if it's a corn on soybean field. And then in terms of environmental conditions, tar spot prefers cooler conditions. And then also it does like some moisture, but Damon Smith at Wisconsin worked on the factors that are important for tar spot. And he found that the more precipitation you had, the less severe the tar spot. So there's something with the wetness that we don't quite understand. We need some moisture, but we don't want those leaves too wet. We're still trying to figure that out, right? So I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but if we go to the Crop Protection Network.org and we look at the prediction model, what we often see is that at the beginning of the growing season, we have a very high risk of tar spot until we get to around about July and August. And then that risk decreases just because we're way too hot for the disease to develop. And then as temperatures cool off kind of the middle of August into September, then that risk goes higher. So tar spot prefers cooler conditions. Southern rust likes those really hot conditions.
And so you mentioned, of course, a really great resource that I did want to highlight with you, and that's the Crop Protection Network.
Yes.
And, farmers, producers, they have a lot of things that they need to track and remember. Yes. And understanding what conditions and, favor what disease development, that can be a lot to remember. Yes. and keep in the brain, right? And so this Crop Protection Network resource is a really fantastic resource. I think of it like a one-stop shop for plant diseases, right?
Yes, I agree.
And so can you talk a little bit just about the Crop Protection Network as a whole and how it can help producers manage all of those pieces of information to help them make those decisions on whether, they should be concerned about a certain disease developing or not?
Okay, so the Crop Protection Network is a website, cropprotectionnetwork.org, or you can just Google Crop Protection Network, it'll pop right up, right? That website has been going for about 10 years now, and it was the brainchild of a couple of folks that I work with, Darren Mueller here at Iowa State University, Kirsten Wise, who's now at University of Kentucky, and then Albert Tenuta, who's with the Ontario Ministry of Ag in Canada. But it's really an extension website, right? And so what we were realizing 10 years ago as we lost resources was that for extension was we were all producing the same information, right? And so instead of doing that, why didn't we just have a website that produced the same information that anybody could access? It doesn't matter if you're in Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, right? You could go there because we're all giving the same message. And so that's basically where it goes. So if you look on the Crop Protection Network, we have resources there for corn, soybeans, wheat, but we're adding other crops now as well. So really, like I'm focused on the corn and soybean, right? So at the website, there are a lot of different publications, like short encyclopedia articles that will tell you about a disease task spot right in the conditions that are favorite. There are some like extension articles. If you think about fungicide sprays, right, should you be applying a fungicide twice for tar spot? Things like that. So there's some articles about that. Sometimes there are articles about research publications that we've written. So we take an academic research publication and we put it into simpler language for extension. So those are there. There's the webinars that can be watched. And then there's also various tools, right? And those tools are very new. They've been developed in the last 3 or 4 years, but probably the best tool I think there is the disease prediction tool. And with that tool, you can go in there, go to the tool, and you can actually pinpoint your field on a map. And this is what I've done for all my research fields. I have them all on this map. And then what I'm able to do is, set the dates that I'm interested in. You can set the date for a week ahead, I think. And then you just run it, and it'll give you a really nice chart on the right, which shows you your risk of disease. So are you at high risk for tar spot? And we have that for grey leaf spot, and we have it for gibberella or don. Hopefully, I was hoping by the time we got to summer, we would have northern corn leaf blight. So I'm not sure where that is. And we're developing something for southern rust. So that might only be available next year. But yeah, so you just put in your field and you can figure out if that field's at risk for tar spot or not. And if it's at risk, then you can decide whether you want to spray a fungicide or not. And once again, the Crop Protection Network has those resources, right? Okay, what is the best fungicide to apply? It's there on the Crop Protection Network. There's fungicide efficacy tables. There's a tool that you can use. Those tools are based on data from corn pathologists across the US. Every single year, we look at our fungicide trials, and then we go in and we rate the different fungicides that are available. Excellent, very good, fair, or no data available for that disease. So you can choose the best product that you want to apply. There's also a ROI tool that we've been developing, which basically you can plug in your numbers, what your expected yield is, and then run it and see, is it going to be worthwhile spraying a fungicide on that crop? Are you going to get a return on investment for that input? Or would you be better off, spending that input cost on something else, right, where you might get bang for your buck? So it's a very comprehensive website. And I like to tell people, when it's rainy and you can't get out in the field and you're sick of catching up with paperwork, check out the Crop Protection Network and have fun looking around and seeing if there's anything useful for you.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And those 3 tools that you just described are kind of like a perfect trifecta, right? So you can go in and figure out what diseases you might be at risk of contracting your crops at least. And then from there, determine, is it going to be worth it to spray or not? Yeah. And then from there, you can also then determine what fungicide might be the most efficacious for those, that crop and that disease. Yep. So It's like I said, that one-stop shop. It's a really, really great resource that I also would encourage folks to kind of plunk around with when they have some time, like you said, on a rainy day.
And it's not just corn, right? I mean, it's soybean as well. So they have a white mold prediction model. They have a frog eye leaf spot prediction model. I'm not too sure what else they have, just because I don't tend to use that a lot. But
sure.
So, check it out. It's worth it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned before, it being an extension resource, I think that's really important to note that, you guys over in Iowa, us in Illinois, and of course, a bunch of other land-grant universities are doing that research, those fungicide efficacy trials. So to put all that information together so that it's unbiased, research-based in that one location is really, really invaluable, I would say.
I mean, you bring up a really good point everything on the crop crop protection network is research-based and comes from the land-grant university. So, pathologists working and entomologists and even agronomists now, weed scientists, right, working at land-grant universities, so, and all based on research.
Yeah, and you also, you shared with me a link that I will provide in the episode description as well. That's a nice summary of the 2025 fungicide efficacy trials that you guys ran. I think it provides a really nice summary of your findings, so I'll include that too.
Okay.
But like we're saying, this happens at every land grant institution. So the state that you're in, you can very easily find that information. And I'll plug Illinois in as well for folks to be able to find too.
Good.
So, Alison, could you maybe talk a little bit about any advice or like general recommendations you make to farmers as we approach those more critical points in the growing season for disease development? So what kind of recommendations do you make in terms of like scouting, when to scout, how often? And when it comes to, if someone is trying to decide whether to apply a fungicide or not, what is your general recommendation for them or any other resources you might point them to?
Okay, such a loaded question. So, things that I'm thinking of, right, is that most of the research has shown that the best time to manage these foliar diseases and apply a fungicide is at tasseling through to about the end of pollination when those silks turn brown, right? So that's kind of where we're going to be looking to manage disease. When a lot of times we don't see disease developing until around about tasseling, right? Whether it be grey leaf spot, northern cornleaf blight, tar spot, southern rust, it's kind of just before tasseling to just after tasseling. One of the resources I forgot at the Crop Protection Network were maps. And so I did go on the map this morning to see where southern rust was. And so my peers have been scouting for southern rust in Georgia and the neighboring state. Is that Mississippi, Alabama? Oh, can't remember my geography, sorry. Anyway, they've been scouting down there. They have not found southern rust yet, right? So beginning of June, southern rust has not been reported in the United States yet, right? But you would be able to, I'll be keeping an eye on that map and just watching, because southern rust is going to start in the south and then it will start moving up northwards, right? So give me an idea of where the southern rust is. Then, that map will also have reports of tar spot, also other diseases. People can report any diseases now. Once again, at the Crop Protection Network, you can go in and report diseases that you're seeing. It's best to always include a photo, and then someone will verify that. Like if you're in Iowa, I'll get a notice, and then I go in and look at the photo and say, oh, Kathryn saw tar spot in Washington County, right? And then I'll go in and I'll turn Washington County red, right? So you can get an idea of where the disease is. So I would be doing that. I would be using the crop prediction tool as well. So just putting my fields in there, not all your fields, but just a sketching of fields, right? And then just seeing what diseases you might be at risk for, walking into those fields, scouting those fields, right? Having a look and seeing if you can find any diseases in the field. I think the toughest thing when it comes to making a fungicide decision is that a lot of times we have very little disease in the field, and it's difficult to make that decision, right? And then also you're relying on the co-op to come out and spray for you, or the helicopter, and you've got to decide because they're only going to be here for the next 10 days and then they're gone, right? And so I get that. I understand that that's really difficult. And so I think the other thing is that if you're going to spray a fungicide, I think that you can rationalize the fields that you're going to apply that fungicide to a little bit better, right? So last year I did some work with Whiffles hybrids where we sprayed a susceptible and a resistant hybrid. Well, two hybrids. One was susceptible to tar spot and one was resistant to tar spot. Okay. And serendipitously, they happen to be susceptible and have pretty good resistance to southern rust as well, right? And so that was great. But I went in and I sprayed those. We did different timings. That's not really the important point. But what we found is, yes, the fungicide controlled the disease on the susceptible and on the resistant, right? But when we looked at the yield response and then calculated the return on investment, we had a return on investment from spraying a fungicide on the susceptible hybrid, but not on the resistant hybrid.
Interesting.
So we just didn't get the yield response right to cover the cost of that hybrid. And so that really drove home the point to me that as you're making these fungicide decisions, go in and look at your fields and identify those fields that are planted to a susceptible hybrid. And if you're going to apply a fungicide, you apply a fungicide to the susceptible hybrids first, right? And then, and all the time, keep in mind that disease triangle, right? So are we getting enough moisture for disease to develop? All of these diseases need moisture, right? If we turn hot and dry, we're not going to have to worry about any of these foliar diseases because we're not going to have enough moisture. So if we have enough moisture, then you can be like keeping an eye on the crop protection network, keeping your ear open at the coffee shop, what's being seen there, keeping up with your extension folks, what are they seeing in the field, right? And then if it looks like we're going to have a bad disease here, well, then you could maybe consider spraying those resistant hybrids. If I'm being honest, I'm not sure that a resistant hybrid ever needs to be sprayed, especially when I think of the severe southern rust we had last year, and we still didn't get a return on investment, right, in my trials. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just a little bit more hesitant to put a fungicide on a resistant hybrid than a susceptible hybrid. So kind of been like waffling away here. I mean, if I'm thinking about what am I going to do, right? I would be looking at my resources, what diseases have been reported in my area, right? Where have I planted what fields are planted to more susceptible hybrids? Am I going to spray a fungicide? Yes. Okay, what fungicide am I going to spray? And I'm going to spray my susceptible hybrids first, and then if I still have enough money left, or if things look, if we're getting a lot of moisture and it looks like it could be a high disease year, then I can go on and spray those resistant hybrids. So I think that's kind of a good summary of what I was trying to say.
Yes, definitely. I would agree. And like you said, it was a little bit of a loaded question. It's a difficult one to answer, but you answered it beautifully and you provided some really great context and information. So thank you for all of that. So Alison, I just have one last question for you, and that is if there are any projects that you're working on right now that you wanted to highlight for those listening today.
Good question. So we continue to work on fungicides, and this year I'm continuing to compare a generic fungicide with a name brand fungicide, right, to see can you get away with spraying a generic fungicide, or do you have to use those name brand fungicides? So we're doing those comparisons again. And I think you mentioned that you're going to include my 2025 fungicide efficacy. So if people are interested in what we saw last year, then they can read that. The other thing that we're looking at this year is applying fungicides at V5. That's not a practice that I'm very fond of, but there's a lot of talk that could maybe help with crown rot. And so I have trials all over the state where we'll be applying at V5, and then we'll be looking to see later on in the growing season, first of all, did we get crown rot? And then if we did get crown rot, did that V5 application help? So we continue to look at that with fungicides. And there was one other thing that I was going to say about that work, and I have just completely forgotten. Okay, can't have been that important then. So,
well, yeah, that all sounds really great, and like you're going to get really great information out of that for producers when, like you said, they're making those decisions on do I need to spend that extra money for the name brand versus a generic. So that'll be really exciting to see what you guys come out with on that.
I remember now. The other thing that we're doing is we have treatments in our fungicide trials where we're using the disease prediction tool on the crop protection network to trigger a fungicide spray.
Okay.
So if the crop protection network tells us that we're at high risk for a disease in that field, then we will go out and apply a fungicide. And so basically, when you look at that high risk, when you look at the prediction tool, it says you should be using it between V10 and R3. So once our crop hits V10, I'll be saying, is anything at high risk for any disease? We'll be spraying a fungicide just to see how well we can use that prediction tool, right, to help us with our fungicide planning. So, yep.
Interesting. That's really cool. I'm especially excited for that one. You're kind of like testing the tool that you've developed in a sense. Yeah. So very cool. Yeah. Well, Alison, thank you so much for joining me today for this episode of Talking Crop. I appreciate you taking the time to share with us your expertise, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Kathryn. I've really had a good time. So thanks.
Once again, that was Alison Robertson, Professor of Plant Pathology and Microbiology and Extension Field Crops Pathologist with Iowa State University. Be sure to join me for the next episode of Talking Crop, for which I'll be speaking with Dr. Nathan Schroeder, Associate Professor of Nematode Anatomy and Biology in the Department of Crop Sciences at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. That episode will release on June 24th. Until then, thanks for Talking Crop.